is today I'm not going to bother with slides. I'm not going to bother with anything like that. I'm going to talk to you and have this kind of conversation with you about what is essentially my kind of area of expertise and things like that as well today. So what I really want to concentrate on is the kind of the psychology of security. Now, I can't for the life of me remember what I gave to Mike as a kind of a bio and an understanding of this, but let's start from the beginning and let's really kind of concentrate on it. Now, for questions by sorry, Mike.
I just need to mute everyone.
Yeah, no worries. And I'm unmuted as well. Brilliant. But yes, if you do have any questions, what I would probably suggest is pop them in chat. If you've got any thoughts, comments, anything you want to put in while I'm talking, pop them into chat. What I'm going to do is make sure that we've got plenty of time towards the end to have a real kind of more extended conversation about the topic in which I'm going to bring up today. So, okay. So a bit about myself and why I'm here to talk to you about today is actually I am the National Fraud and Cybercrime Prevention Manager for UK Finance. Now, UK Finance is the kind of the UK's trade body for all the financial industry, and we have over 300 and something members of the financial industry, including all the banks. But actually, as a part of my role, I am actually seconded across to a national police unit. So we are called the Dedicated Card and Payment Crime Unit, or the DCPCU. Law enforcement, both this side of the pond and the other side of the pond, we do love our acronyms, and unfortunately it doesn't really roll off the tongue very easily. But I am in a national police unit that's made up of City of London Police and Metropolitan Police, but I am in fact employed by UK Finance. So my little corner of our police unit is very much around the kind of the crime prevention, and it's the education that comes behind that. Now, I come from a background of law enforcement, both Norfolk and Suffolk. So I used to be Norfolk and Suffolk Constabulary. I used to work in intelligence. I then worked in counterterrorism for a good 2 years after that. And then the last 2 years of my 6-year career in Norfolk and Suffolk Constabulary was indeed cybercrime and fraud, where I kind of found my passion, so to speak. Now, interestingly enough, the stuff I'm going to be talking to you about, it started when I went into counterterrorism and eventually in cyber. Now, what I found was when I went into the cybercrime unit is that my whole job was very similar to what I do now. It's so much more about educating people, but they're both the public, it's businesses, organizations, about how to protect themselves against fraud and cyber. Now, the thing is, I'd come from 4 years in intelligence and counterterrorism. Now, at no point did anybody refuse to me and say, it's not really a problem, I'm not going to worry about it. Like, everybody worries about terrorism. Everybody, there's not anybody that I would ever say that doesn't worry about terrorism or something along those lines, or any traditional types of crime. But when I went into fraud and cyber, and especially cybercrime, is I'm going out and trying educating it, and I felt resistance. I felt resistance from the public. I felt resistance from businesses and organizations. And this weird case where, well, actually, it's much more likely that you're a victim of fraud and cybercrime or something along those lines, but you don't see it as a risk. And it got me thinking, because what this has then therefore actually created is this, what has essentially been this 7-year rabbit hole around trying to understand how human beings assess risk. And specifically, how do people assess risk when it comes to counter fraud, cybersecurity, and the psychology around security of how people make those assessments? So I've come down this 7-year rabbit hole, and actually I'm probably most likely starting my PhD in this subject as of September this year as well, much for my sins. But the whole point of this is that the more and more I explore this subject, the more and more I realize how human beings are utterly preposterous. And the way we make decisions, the way we assess risk about ourselves is equally preposterous and ridiculous, because we like to think that we are incredibly logical, rational human beings. And the more and more I study this field is the more and more I realize that that is so far from the truth. So let me give you an example. And I apologize, this is a more emotional sense as well. But There's a real key issue behind this around cyber and fraud, is that if I say to you, a young girl looks in the mirror and she hates what she sees. Now, this girl, a young teenager, for instance, is that she looks in the mirror and she hates what she sees. And it might be elements of mental health. It might be about the body dysmorphia. It might be any sort of element of personal image in which she would see. Now, she can go to her parents, she can go to her grandparents, she's going to go friends, whoever they are, and they want to have this discussion, but they don't understand where she's coming from. They don't understand where she is in her head and why she sees what she sees. But the problem is now, is that from a social media point of view and internet, is that the internet is very much a large aspect of inclusion. Because for a lot of people, for the vast majority of the human population at the moment, is where do you go to find people who believe in what you believe? The internet and social media. For a lot of people, that's very much the truth. Now, the issue is with this is that, and again, I'm a big believer that technology isn't the enemy. However, our relationship with it certainly needs some work. And especially this is very, very true for the likes of social media and content and the internet as a whole. Because what the internet does do, is you have the option to find a community of millions of people who believe in what you believe, whether that be train spotting, whether it's the Mac user groups, whether it's a hobby, whatever it is, the internet brings inclusivity. You wouldn't be able to have this conversation in the same way, and especially with COVID, as connected as all. But for this young girl is that she's finding a community of people who think the same way as she does and supports her in the way in which she actually feels about herself. And that's quite negative in some way. Now, the issue is that she may post pictures about herself. She might post pictures online or something along those lines. But actually, so many people can abuse her. So many people can to ridicule her or troll her. But actually, one person comes out of the woodwork, and this man says, you know what, I think you're beautiful. I think you're incredible. I'd love to see more pictures. I'd love to see you more. I'd love to talk to you. Now, the problem is with this is that all of a sudden we all feel very uncomfortable with this case study, this example, because we all know now that, again, this man has the power that this man has over this young girl. Now, this is grooming, this is manipulation, this is sexual exploitation. It could be 101 things, etc. And it's a dire, horrible subject. And you feel it. And you feel the horrible aspects around what society can do. And the fact is what could happen as a result of this story. Now, the issue here is that you have had an emotional reaction. Now, when I talk to you about terrorism, if I say to you terrorism, violence, assault, burglary, drugs, all these sorts, and if I just list off every single crime type that you can possibly imagine, you have a really good understanding of the emotional impact of these crimes. You have an understanding of what they mean. And again, you have an emotional reaction to every single one. But if I say to you fraud, if I say to you cybercrime, is actually the biggest and key element to why we don't necessarily protect ourselves that much online and through from a fraud point of view in our data, is because cyber and fraud is not an emotional problem. We don't have the same emotional hooks that we do with every other types of crime. Now, terrorism, for instance, is that, yes, okay, nobody on this call will ever say that terrorism isn't a bad thing. But statistically, it's much more likely you get struck by lightning than ever being a victim of a terrorist attack. But from a fraud point of view, in the UK, biggest crime type in the UK, absolutely by a considerable margin. It's much more likely that you're a victim of fraud or a cybersecurity than any other crime put together. Now, the very fact that this is a key is that actually we're not motivated to protect ourselves to the thing that's the most. And this comes down to the fact that actually human beings in the way in which we assess risk. So let me give an example. Air travel, for instance. Now, air travel, a good proportion of us on this call, for the 66 of us at the moment, is that some of you will be absolutely petrified of flying. Some of you will be, I'll get on, etc. I might be able to do it and engage with it and etc. I'm uneasy about flying, but I can cope with it. But even on this element of the fact that actually I could get in the plane, but I'm not scared at all. But even if you don't not scared or you have no fear of it, you still read the laminated card. You still read and listen to the security briefing or the safety briefing. But you'll also maybe like feel around for the life jacket. You might look up and see where the oxygen masks come down. But the case when it comes to our safety is that actually you're motivated to understand what you should do in the event of, and your safety and security, only because you have a really good visceral and emotional understanding of what can happen to you going at hundreds and hundreds of miles in a large steel and aluminium tube. Because you have seen enough 1990s action movies and you've seen enough news stories to give you a really good example of that. But if I told you that statistically, it's much more likely that something bad happens to you on the way to the airport than ever up in the air, does that change your feeling about flying? No. Does that change your feeling about getting in the car and driving anywhere? No. Because a pileup on the M25 around London or the interstate in Florida does not make a good news story as compared to an air crash. So a lot of our risk is, and our perception of risk is based on our emotions. But also something, and again, in a complicated sort of fashion, is it's something called the availability heuristic. And that is basically what's called a cognitive heuristic. In English, it is a mental shortcut in which we use to assess the probability or importance of something in our mind. Now, parents in the room, grandparents in the room, did your sense of risk and sense of value pretty much change overnight when you had children? Of course it did. Your sense of risk is based on what you value. And again, what you value is also the ease of which information and images come to mind. And the fact that actually a pileup on the road or the interstate, etc., will not make a good news story, nor does it make a particularly interesting Fast and the Furious film. But the whole concept of our perception of risk is based on what we emotionally assign to it. So when we don't have an emotional trigger, is that I can spend the rest of the evening, the rest of the week, the rest of the weekend talking to you about exactly what you need to do in order to protect yourself entirely from fraud and cybercrime. But I can't motivate you to do it. And this is the key issue, is that you only assess risk based on what you value. And very often is that we have had this massive change in the way in which we're supposed to value something. For instance, in 14 years, we have had this massive move to online banking, to contactless payments, to transferring, the ability to transfer money at the drop of a hat. And all this customer innovation and user experience and the way in which our money has changed is that actually we're a lot more detached from what we're supposed to be protecting. So when it's my money, when it's your cash, it's just generally a lot easier to protect your cash or protect your assets or protect your house because you have an inherent emotional link to its protection. The thing is that now it's represented in ones and zeros on an online banking app or something along those lines, but also your data. And this is the real key issue when we're talking about the psychology of our own security, and especially online, is that we don't value our own data. Is that for so long now, we have been conditioned to give our data away. Whether that be your email, whether that be your username, whether that be your identity, etc. We're always forever really filling out forms. We're always doing all these sorts of things and giving data away in a transaction for a service, a good, an account, or whatever it may be. We're conditioned to give our data away. the more we're conditioned to give it away, the less we value it. So let me give you an example of that. Is that if, for instance, you saw somebody with a clipboard and a kind of an apron in a charity apron, for instance, in the middle of your high street, what would you do? Now, the majority of you, when I talk about this, that seeing somebody with a clipboard, etc., and look about to maintain eye contact with you in the middle of the high street somewhere, is that you normally want to do this massive semicircle around this person or try to direct eye contact somewhere else and completely ignore them. But interestingly enough, is that that's the key, is that the motivations as to why you do that is because I don't want to get spammed with the information. I don't want to give my data away. And it's an inconvenience. I don't have time. I don't want them to start sending me emails. But the data in which you would give that person with a clipboard is minuscule compared to the data that you give away every day. But the biggest key aspect around this is because it's an inconvenience to do it in the first example. So because we've been conditioned to give it away, is that data is very abundant. So when we're talking about the kind of psychology, is that, again, going back to that idea of risk, the fraud, cybercrime, it's not really an emotional issue. We don't necessarily see the value of what it is that we're protecting because, again, we're conditioned to give away our data. And that's the fundamental key aspect to all of our security. So your username, your passwords, all these sorts of things. You don't see the risk. You don't see the value. And equally, if you don't see any of those things, you are not motivated to protect yourself and actually go about looking at your security. Now, when I talk about this is a general population model. Like again, fraud has increased by absolute billions in the last couple of years. And again, it's this case where I'm never going to be out of a job, which is good. I'm pleased about this. However, the reason I'm in a job like this is a part of a problem. So it's this case where you don't see the risk, you don't see the value, and it comes down to the motivation. So what could I do to motivate you, to educate yourself, to educate the people around you, to take security really seriously? Now, the problem is that because it's technology-based, it's also a different language. Now, when you first joined the user group, for instance, or you first picked up a Mac or you first picked up a computer, is that very often the terminology is part of the problem in understanding it because you're trying to break down and understanding what's what. Now, the issue with this is that when it comes to fraud and cyber, is the issue, it comes down to the issue where if I, for instance, wanted you, again, apologies if any of you do speak German, but for instance, if you don't speak German or don't speak a foreign language, is that I want you to learn German, but I never ever want you to go to Germany or speak to a German person. Are you motivated to learn German? No. And this is the case, is that what we're trying to do is educate people and give them the top 10 tips to secure themselves and all these sorts of things, when in reality, people don't see why I should do it in the first place, because I don't see the risk. So what I'm actually asking, and that's why the thing is with the emotional hook, because if I switch that round and said, look, I want you to learn German, but I want you to go and live in Germany and work in Germany, and I want to lead the new German Berlin user group or something like that for Mac, you're pretty motivated to learn German. And that's the thing, is that if you don't see the risk, you don't value it, you don't have motivation. And this comes into this real concoction of why people do not take their security online as seriously as they should. Because this is a huge, huge issue. For instance, let's say passwords. Let's go into passwords. Passwords, the bane of all of our existences. Yeah, more or less. And the fact is with passwords is that we're told repeatedly that you should have a unique, complicated, long password for every single platform that you have. And the way you store that, it could be on Keychain, it could be on LastPass, it could be on a password manager or something along those lines, which I would always suggest having a somewhat of a password manager to use. But the thing is with passwords is that if you think about your security for your emails, for your account, or pretty much any account, what's it made up of? So your username, which is 99% of the time your email, and your password. Now, when was the last time you changed your email? Now, most people, when I talk to you about your personal email, you can't even remember. Like, you probably haven't actually changed the email. It's probably 20, 25, 30 years old by this point, etc. And you've only had to change it because probably the business went out of a commission or something along those lines, or got bought out. So this email is 50% of your security verification for every single account that you have in your digital life. Where do you reset all your security? Your emails. And over time, if you think about the exposure of your email, because there is not one person on this phone call, on this Zoom call, sorry, that has not been a victim of a data breach at some point. All of you. And that's the thing, is that because data breaches are so abundant, there's barely a week goes by that a data breach hasn't happened, or whether it's Amazon, whether it's Facebook, whether it's all these different platforms, etc. All of these have been victims of a data breach in some fashion. Now, if I then say, well, actually, what's the other 50% of all your security authentication? It's your passwords. Excellent. Now, okay. Now, I'm not going to name and shame people, because there's probably a few of you that will reuse passwords and have reused passwords on many different platforms. So I'm not going to name and shame. I'm certainly not going to ask that question. But the reason for this is that we reuse it because it's impossible for us to remember all our unique passwords. Excuse me. Now, the case is that, yeah, if I can't remember it, I'm going to try and use a similar password or reuse it somewhere. Now, if you think about it, then you've got the email, which is the most publishable thing about you in the world, and the thing that you've had the longest and has not changed, versus a password. Now, if I've reused that password and it's been victim of a data breach, then I can, as a criminal, what I immediately do is go to every single account I can possibly find and use that password with your email. Now, if you reuse your password, I immediately get access to that platform, to that account of whatever I want to do. This is why we always say, don't reuse passwords. Because the fact is, if I said, right, your front door, if I swapped your key for a password, would you remember it? Of course you would, because you're motivated to protect what it is that it's locking. However, would you want to reuse that password anywhere else? No. It's like basically telling me I'm going to have the same key for every single car, garage door, everywhere I go. I'm going to reuse the key everywhere. You wouldn't do that. Like, that seems preposterous. But if I was then to tell you that actually the password to your front door has been compromised, it's been released to the public, and all of a sudden everybody knows where you live, how quickly would you change that password? Like, immediately, like literally you'd be stopping this Zoom call and going and changing the password. Why? Because you're motivated to protect what it is that password is locking and protecting. Now, that is the key difference, is that if I said to you that you are definitely a victim of a data breach and your passwords have been compromised in some sort of account somewhere, etc., did you do the same thing? No. No, we don't. And that's the thing, is because, for instance, your emails, which is essentially your central repository for your entire digital footprint and online life, and therefore your life, is that where do you reset all your security? Your emails. So when we talk about the security of your identity online and the security of your livelihood and all these sorts of things, is your emails are so, so important. So again, if I was to gain access to your emails, I'm not going to ask you, for instance, because again, if you've got two-factor authentication or a method to protect your emails, if I get into your emails, I basically own your soul. And that's the real key issue, is that we don't prioritize in the same way because we don't value what it is that it's protecting. Technology tends to hide behind this emotional barrier because, well, as technology, I don't really get it. I'm not good with technology. I'm not motivated to protect it because, oh, well, it's just, I've got no data. I've got nothing to to steal. I've got no data to find. But actually, we do. We always do. And whether that's the images that you store in your files, whether it's the holiday pictures, whether it's family pictures, whether it's your spreadsheet that you do your accounting on, all these sorts of things, is that it is always relative. And the fact is, from a security point of view, is that it's so difficult to try and get this across to people, because we don't value the what it is we're protecting. Therefore, I'm not going to listen to what I need to do to protect myself, because I could spend this entire session educating you exactly what you need to do on your Mac to protect yourself from viruses, from this, etc. But actually, I could tell you, but without that underlying motivation to protect the thing that you're actually trying to protect, is that it's not sustainable. It's like, for instance, going back to the language idea. Have you ever tried to learn a language, but never having any intention to go on holiday to the place, or to go and talk to people of that same language? I just want to learn Russian. Do you want to go to Russia? No. Then it doesn't last long, because you don't have the motivation to teach yourself and to actually take it as a priority in your life. So, and it's the same with cybersecurity. It's the same with this kind of psychology of security, is because it falls through these kind of psychological gaps. And the same with passwords. Now, the overarching aspect around passwords is try to make them complicated, make sure they're not dictionary words, etc. Again, don't reuse them as well. But it also comes down to the fact that actually use password managers. Now, some people will criticize my advice around the usage password managers. However, I am backed up by the National Cybersecurity Center, and I am certified by the National Cybersecurity Center. But people will still critique my advice of that. But if somebody gets in your password manager, then they've got you. And I was like, yes, you do. But you make sure that it's a unique password for the manager, and also other ways of securing it. So the thing is with password managers is it tends to block out that psychology. It makes it more convenient for you to use unique passwords in everything that you do, as opposed to you trying to remember it. So the benefits of those risks far outweighs the probability that somebody breaks into your password manager. It's all a very interesting trade-off about how we look at that security and risk. So there's passwords. There's, again, if you use that key for your front door analogy and think about your passwords, then you know what I'm talking about, because the amount of data that you have, and the information that you have. Because I want to ask you a question. How do you prove who you are? How do you prove that you own anything? So whether that's a house, whether it's a car, whatever it is again, how do you prove who you are? And how do you prove who you are to online accounts? All through this personal data and information that makes you you. Now, that could be your emails, your passwords, your first name, your last name, your date of birth, account information, all these sorts of things that create this kind of digital footprint as well. Just seeing in chat, Kevin, absolutely, is again very useful link that Kevin has linked, is have I been pwned? So it's, again, you can put in your email and see what they've got, a collection of data breaches that you may have been compromised by in the past. It doesn't always include every single one, because the more mainstream ones, again, from a big data breach, they're not always included on the website, but it is a very good start in relation to if it potentially is compromised on that basis as well. Sorry. Unfortunately, I don't normally sound like a kind of a low budget Bond villain, because I've got a bit of a tickly cough. Luckily not COVID, because I've had about 3 tests, so that's good. So this is the case. We don't value our data, or we don't inherently value our data, which I'm on a big mission to try and get people to kind of think about their identity, etc. If we don't value our data, we don't see the risk around the threat to it. If we don't see the risk, we're not motivated. And this concoction leads down this garden path of our own security is because we then don't explore ways in which how better to secure us. Now, again, and I feel this is a very interesting concept, because the amount of people that say, okay, well, I don't need antivirus or firewalls because I have a Mac. I'm like, okay. I'd be a rich man if I had £1 every time somebody said that. But the fact is that yes, okay, the infrastructure from an iOS point of view and a Mac OS point of view are inherently a lot more secure than, for instance, Windows or an Android platform as well, mainly because it's a closed software or a closed source. However, 98% of all cyber attacks, malware, malicious software, all these sorts of things are all through social engineering. Now, when I say social engineering, I mean manipulation. Now, when we talk about manipulation, is that everybody on this call has been told something that they wanted to hear at the wrong time that you probably wanted to hear it. Now, that could be relationships, it could be friendships, it could be work, it could be anything. Everyone on this call has been told something that they wanted to hear. Now, it's a very difficult aspect, because when we talk about social engineering, is that no matter, yes, okay, firewalls, antivirus is incredibly important for your platforms and for your devices, etc. However, when a lot of people regard it as your kind of first and only line of defense, well, actually, it's your last line of defense. So by the point your antivirus is kicking in to try and stop a virus being included on your platform or installing itself on your platform, is that actually that is the last point, because if it doesn't pick it up, it gets installed and it's on your machine. So those platforms are very much the last line, because the thing is, when you see a phishing email, so an email that comes through, wants you to click on a link, it wants you to enter bank details or whatever it is, etc. It could be a smishing text or a text message scam. It could be, again, all these sorts of things that come through, is that 90% of all cyber attacks, all sort of compromises like that, come through this way. And this is the case, is that what we do is we try and educate people around the nuance of trying to identify a phishing email. Now, yes, okay, if you're on a Mac, you can hover over the link. It might tell you where it's potentially going. You don't want to go to somewhere that looks potentially dangerous. Also, the email could be hidden behind, might not look like the organization it is. And there's a lot of things that I could give you as top 10 tips to protect yourself. However, is that the biggest issue is that the packaging of fraud may change, but the flavor of fraud and the way in which fraud and cyber attacks, etc. And I talk about fraud and cyber in pretty much the same sort of sentence, mainly because it's only us that make it, and law enforcement and people that make an arbitrary divide between the two, because 88% of all fraud is cyber enabled. So it's all through technology and your devices, etc. So most fraud is pretty much the same way. So this is the case. It's so inherent on the fact that when we do click on a link, we are inviting to install a platform or malware onto our machines. We are inviting that process onto it. Now, because you're clicking on the link, you might even also go to a separate website, and you may be asked to put in different pieces of data as well. But this all comes back to the fact that I want you to think about that intentional choice when you're giving away your data. Because if you think about your data and who you're giving it to, and think, well, if I value this and I want to protect this, then I'm going to make a more conscious choice about who I give it to, where I give it to. Is this website secure? Is this indeed the organization or my bank or platform that I should engage with? Because that's the thing, is that once you value what it is that you're protecting, is that you have this intuitive response to say, actually, I'm going to be a little bit more critical about where I'm putting it and what I'm doing with it. So this is really the case about it. And it's so much more of an issue rather than giving you the granular details around how to protect yourself. Because again, Get Safe Online, the National Cybersecurity Center website, really, really good if you want those information to really educate yourself in relation to that as well. Now, Kevin and Mark, really good points in that. Very often, from a security point of view, from an operating system or OS, keeping up to date on apps as well is very, very good, because 9 times out of 10, most of those updates are indeed security related or patching as well. So no, really, really good points in that respect as well. So it's a very interesting topic, because when we talk about the psychology of security, it also comes down to the way in which we operate our technology and our text messages and our social media and our emails. Is because I also specialize in the language in which it's used and how it's used from a forensic linguistics point of view on technology. So I'd like to ask you a question, is that, okay, we've talked about the fact that we don't value data. We've talked about that we don't see the risk. I'm asking you to think about how you value it in the first place. I'm asking you again how you may be motivated about it, but also the fact that actually, again, it could be clicking on links. It could be making sure your passwords are correct as well. But also the fact is that no matter what, from a phishing email, from a fraud point of view, from a cyber point of view, what I want to do is I want to trigger an emotion. Is that no matter what, I want to trigger either a positive or negative emotion in you in order to get you to do something. So this is the real bare bones of that social engineering and manipulation that people do in order to infect your computer or to get you to give me data. So again, investment scams. We're massive spate of investment scams over the last couple of years. Oh, we've got this incredible opportunity for you to invest in this portfolio, such and such and such and such. And again, it's the excitement that gets carried away. What we tend to do when these individuals are engaging with us and those emails, it's a once in a lifetime opportunity. It's a scarce resource. It's a limited offer, all these sorts of things. And from a phishing point of view, it looks really interesting. It looks really enticing. Again, from an investment point of view, I could really get in front of this portfolio. I could provide for my family, etc., bearing on this investment. Now, those rose nearly 40% over COVID. Because guess what? People were concerned about the future. Excuse me. People were concerned about the future. People were concerned and trying to make sure that they could secure themselves for the future. And unfortunately, fraudsters and criminals are incredibly good at finding that out and exploiting our weaknesses in that respect. So when something is too good to be true, it is too good to be true. But when we are in an emotional state, we also don't necessarily think clearly. We don't see the red flags that come with it. And we don't necessarily take the action that comes with it. Now, when I said that most fraud and most of this kind of crime type is coming through our text messages, our emails, etc. So I want to ask you a question. Have you ever taken an email the wrong way from a colleague? Have you ever taken a text message the wrong way from a partner or a family member? And then realized actually that's not what they intended to say at all. And very often when I ask this is that when you read something, is that very often you read it in the tone of how you feel right now. Now, this is incredibly, so during COVID, during the lockdowns, etc., this fraud rose so high because almost as nations, as the entire world, we're all in this kind of shared stressful state of uncertainty and not knowing what's going on. Now, the problem is with this is that when a text message comes through and gives you an opportunity, it gives you a tax rebate, it gives you a parcel or a link to do something, or it gives you an opportunity. I was like, oh, well, you've missed this payment or something along those lines. Whatever the phishing email, whatever the flavor of fraud or cybercrime that it might be, is that we were clicking on links. We were giving away our data because we weren't thinking clearly. Now, that's exactly what I want to do as a fraudster, is I want to trigger an emotion in you in order to do it. Now, going back to the question around valuing our data, is it still the same case? Is that so often, and one of the biggest crime types that we're dealing with at the moment, especially from the financial industry and law enforcement, is what's called APP, and it's authorized push payment. Now, authorized push payment is actually a very complicated industry term of saying you're the one that transferred the money. Now, the issue here is that from a fraud point of view, very often you are very protected if an unauthorized transaction goes out of your bank. Very often you will be reimbursed if there's absolutely no evidence that you were the one who transferred those funds. The issue here is that fraudsters are realizing this, and again, I noticed the comment around the kind of victimless crime is that criminals do see it as a victimless crime because they think the banks are reimbursing it. But unfortunately, it's not always the case. Yes, the banks will do as well as they can to actually reimburse you, but very often the banks are also the last to know in this respect. Now, romance scams, for instance, rose again another 38–40% over COVID because people were lonely. People were being exploited by something very core to themselves: love, affection, hope, loneliness, isolation. Excuse me. All these sorts of things, all these emotions, all in this kind of tinderbox, and people were exploiting that. And what they were doing is they were exploiting them over weeks, over months, over a year in some cases, where then they'd say, oh, I need a medical bill to be paid for, or something along those lines. And people were doing the transfers over to them. The problem is that you are the one that authorized that transaction. So when you're making those transactions, whether it's on your online banking, you'll have that little pop-up that's really irritating, isn't it? It's really irritating. Are you sure you want to make this payment? Are you sure? Like, yes, I'm sure. It's to my brother, it's to my family, it's to my daughter, whoever it is, I'm sure. That's the reason why it's there. Now, the problem is the bank, again, very much the last to know in any of these fraudulent transactions. And that's why that security is there for you. But what I want you to really think about is what it is that I'm protecting, what it is that the data that I'm protecting. And again, going all through these kind of psychological factors, etc., is that it doesn't matter, because it comes down to making those choices around your data, but also your money. Who am I speaking to? Who am I engaging with? Like, is this company legitimate? And I'm not telling you to go around with a foil hat on your head and just try to be absolutely completely scared about everything that goes out in the world. But if you value what it is that you then are motivated to start thinking about security in a different sort of way. Now, there's also something on top of this, is that the reason why we're also quite susceptible to text messages and emails is that there's something called the causality bias. Now, the causality bias means that human beings can see cause or put two and two together as easy as you do color. So, for instance, parcel scams, particularly good for this. So just before Christmas, normally fraudsters start sending out text messages and emails around fake Amazon scams, Royal Mail, DHL, UPS, whatever business parcel company it is. And they'll send these phishing emails out all the time. And it's really good business up before Christmas. Fascinatingly wise is that they'll just say, oh, it's $2.99 for it's not enough delivery cost or packaging costs on this delivery. Please click on this link and pay the $2.99. Now, most people, the problem is that the first thing you think of when you see that text message, when you see that email, what have I ordered? You don't automatically think it's a scam. Like, if you're anything like me, I'm forever ordering something online, I'm afraid. And so again, in the sea of notifications that I would not necessarily have, is that I'm thinking, okay, what did I order? What would it come in by UPS or DHL or something like that? Now, the issue is that you are only going to recognize that it's a scam when it gets down to, okay, well, actually, they shouldn't be asking me for extra details. But what these parcel scams are really good at is saying, oh, it's only $2.99 that I need to pay for. So what I do is I click on the link, I go to a website, which is fake, and I type in my information, my data. And guess what? I'm going to put in my account card number, my expiry date, and the little 3-digit code on the back of your card to pay the $2.99. But what you've inadvertently done is actually given away your entire account details and your credit card number. So that $2.99 may go out of your bank, but also they may actually do more with it as well. So yes, it's this kind of security that, well, actually that intentional choice, if I get to that point, well, who am I giving my data to? Where am I giving it? Is this website real? Is this company real? Is this really a parcel scam? And in any sort of scam, any sort of phishing email, even whatever it is, even if you think that it could be legitimate and you're not sure, and you've got that kind of sense where I don't want to give my data because, again, it could be something untoward, is that what you need to do is make sure that you go to and search for the company that you're dealing with. So whether it's the number on the back of your card or whether it's the legitimate website that I want to visit, and don't follow through the links, and actually do your own checks and research to find that site and contact them otherwise. Because a bank, an organization, a parcel, etc., they're not going to have a problem with you giving a call and saying, I've just got this text message. Is this something untoward? Have I actually got an unpaid delivery, etc.? Or again, from a bank point of view, is it indeed a security check or something along those lines? Because there are so many thousands of ways in which people are using and utilizing to exploit us. And that's the horrible truth around it. But this is it, is that once we end up valuing it, looking at our passwords, looking at securing ourselves so much more, is that it really stops this, and it gives you much more of a kind of intuitive reaction to giving away your data. Because that's all criminality really is around fraud and cyber and your security, is our data. And no matter what flavor of fraud it is, no matter what packaging it is, it does come down to that information. And again, the psychology around protecting it in the first place. What I'd also add on top of that, and one thing I probably should have talked about when I was talking about passwords, is very much the idea around two-factor authentication, or MFA, or multi-factor authentication. Now, what I mean by this is, again, it's the text message that comes through your phone with a code. It's the app that from, again, Authenticator, is if you've got two-factor authentication, it'll come up with a location and you put in a different code in order to log into a different platform. Apply it to as much as you can. I know it's a pain. I absolutely know it's a pain to get that code, to get that authentication code, etc. But you have to remember, like I talked about emails, like I talked about passwords, is that the two factors for getting into your any of your account, especially your emails, is a email that you've had for God knows how many years, your password that you've possibly reused somewhere else has been hijacked, making sure that that is a unique password. But with two-factor authentication, it means that I don't just have to have that data that has been out there in the wild that I've gained access to, but it is also the means that I have to have access to your phone. It means I have to have access to, again, if you do any online banking, that little dongle that you put in the code or your PIN, etc., to verify transactions. That's all part of what's called multi-factor authentication. Put it on as much as you possibly can, and prioritize. Again, you will have it with your bank automatically, but think about applying it to your emails, especially as a number one, because again, is that your emails are basically your soul, because it's where you reset your security everywhere. Because if I lock you out of your emails, I could assure you it is not a pleasant experience. I've seen it done very often. And actually, speaking from experience, I used to do what's called red teaming, and red teaming is the term for basically saying that I would target businesses and I would test their security and figure out ways in which I could break them. And unfortunately, I'd love to say that it was really sophisticated and really complicated, and it's all witchcraft and mysticism. No, it's really simple. Just send an email. So it's all about your own trade-off. It's all about your own perception of your own security. It's also about the fact that most of you will not be emotionally motivated to protect yourself because you don't think it's an issue. Is that so many businesses, so many small to medium enterprises, I've seen thousands and thousands of SMEs and businesses and organizations go under overnight because they've been crippled by a cyber attack. But they didn't think it was an issue because, oh, well, we're a small business. We've got nothing to steal. Like, yeah, but it's your livelihood. Your emails, again, it's your entire life. It's everything you order, everything you do. We don't like to think how much of an impact our digital footprint and our life has, but it's this cruel aspect of humanity at the moment, unfortunately, in so many different ways. Because no matter how little you think you use the internet and concepts and etc., if you have an email, and again, unless you're living in a rock, more than happy to, again, it's reclusive, but the very fact is that it's taking it seriously and actually thinking about what it is that you're protecting in the first as well. So what I wanted to do is really spend as much time as we could having a conversation, because I can talk about the main principles. This in a very potted version is basically my PhD. My PhD is about really looking into the granular details as to why fraud and cyber is not an emotional problem. And because it's not an emotional problem, is that is why we are looking at our own pandemic of fraud and cyber attack. Like it's massive. It's huge. So this is the question. Now you're more than welcome to. I will actually. What I'll do is I'll extend the chat function, and we can go through it. And if I see if there's any picking out, and you're more than welcome to shout out, etc. If I just keep on going through the questions, and we can do that. So, okay. So Mark responded to Don about antivirus. I always think it's belt and braces. I think it's very much the case is that yes, Macs are very much more secure inherently in relation to their infrastructure, but because of the late nature of phishing and smishing and all these sorts of things, if you do click on a link, again, I think sometimes the myth around Macs don't get viruses is still quite prevalent. I'm again, from a user group like yourselves, I don't think that myth would be promulgated, etc. But the amount of times I've heard it is quite often, mainly because that myth comes from more or less the kind of mid-90s, is that when people were starting to really make a criminal industry out of writing malicious code for platforms, well, Mac only and Apple only had a significantly small portion of the entire market. So why would I write malware for such a small piece of market? That's why it was generally considered that Macs would be safer, because they didn't get viruses. No, it's just because people didn't really write them because it wasn't a priority, because Windows and Linux kind of had much more the share of the market. So it was kind of more bang for my buck if I was going to write something mad. So yes, keeping your operating system apps updated, absolutely, is incredibly important into making sure that those are updated. Because if you think about it from a malware point of view, there are, last count, probably about 300,000 new pieces of malware created every day. Now, if you think about it, that's a kind of a rising seawater in relation to malicious software. And you think about Apple and Windows and Microsoft and all these sorts of things, etc. All those updates are trying to build the defenses against this ever rising tide of malware, vulnerabilities, and all these sorts of things in your systems. So yes, keep party updates as well. Very good, Kevin, as well, your router, and keeping that up to date as well. Carl, would you recommend using an authenticator app instead of 2FA with your phone? So from that point is I would generally say anything's better than nothing. However, now an authenticator app, yes, I think is probably the way to go, because you have that screen time, you have a certain amount of time where that code is available. and you kind of issue that authenticator app, etc., like that, and it can link to that particular account. Now, Edwin then follows in with, if a phone is lost or stolen, how can you recover access, especially to my email? Now, there will always be, again, if you say, for instance, you're on Microsoft or on Gmail or something along those lines, is you can provide a number of security fail-safes. So if you lose your phone, for instance, and you can't get in, then there will be a recovery seed or a recovery ability, and another way in which to send the code, whether it's to your mobile phone number or it's to another email or something along those lines. So you really explore the settings, because this is different for every single account that you'll have. Unfortunately, I wish I could give you a consistent answer to that, but it will change pretty much for everything, unfortunately. But I would generally recommend an authenticator app because it's also convenient. So for instance, if I'm on Microsoft, for instance, if I want to log into my emails, it will pop up on my Apple Watch and it will say, do you approve this transaction? And I go, yes, and it logs me in. So out of convenience, I find the apps are much more useful. Kevin's right. SMS codes are not that secure, but more secure than using nothing. Absolutely, Kevin. So Billy, back of house question. Does anybody get these bastards? What does that look like? Does it actually happen? So, okay. So yes, we do. So the DCPCU, for instance, my unit, we became basically the COVID smishers squad during COVID lockdowns, because in the UK, especially, there was a massive, huge uptick of text message scams. You probably all had them, didn't you? From NHS track and trace scams, from GPs and all these sorts of things. Text message went through the window. Now, during lockdowns, again, we arrested probably 40 plus people in relation to that. The problem is that from a smishing point of view, every single one was under 18. Every single one. The youngest one was 12. So it's, again, the problem is with fraud, it is kind of a gateway crime. It's like normally you would say in a traditional sort of thing, they get into shoplifting and drug dealing and all these sorts of things. No, it's fraud now. It's much easier. It's much easier. So it's a difficult one, especially from a mass point of fraud. Even the large, more sophisticated frauds as well, and cyber attacks, etc., is that, especially fraud, you don't necessarily get the custodial sentences that you'd want. And that's the problem, is it's not necessarily a massive de-incentive for people to get involved in fraud when you could probably spend less than a year in prison and then come out and do it again. So it's difficult, because from a cybercrime point of view, yes, you do get a lot more longer sentences and impacts, but fraud still not. And that's the really difficult one, because it's still seen as this kind of victimless crime. It's not quite an emotional problem there, and it's also not reflected in jurisdiction and legislation and all these sorts of things as well. So yeah, Billy, not a great thing, if I'm honest, if I'm really brutally honest about it. Don, general feelings of NMUGs outside Mac experts is that AV software is not needed on Macs. Okay. Yes, I would probably say, again, if you don't want to have antivirus, etc., on Macs, fair enough. I guess I'm just probably more risk averse in the respect to it. And again, the availability of antivirus, etc., on things like Macs are, again, it's not necessarily as required as it would do for a Windows PC or an Android platform, etc., which is again the truth. I just would err on the side of caution. Again, it's just knowing how viruses and malware works. So,
thank you, Paul.
No worries, my pleasure. Teach not to click links. Use an email redirection service. I can recommend 33mail. Yeah, excellent. Sue, do you recommend VPNs? If so, do you have any recommendations? And if one, because it's a bit inflexible and based in the USA, every time I use it, I can't access the COVID reporting site because they think I'm not in the UK. Okay, so virtual private networks, or VPNs, I would always suggest try to use them. The issue is that platforms like, and again, that's a really good example, the COVID reporting site. Hold on a second, you're not in the UK, go away. You're not allowed to report. So it's a pain in the ass sometimes, if I'm honest, and be really brutal, is that sometimes with VPNs, they don't necessarily do it. However, some VPNs allow you to say, well, actually, I want to pick London as my proxy site, and I can still access UK sites with no issues, and it still thinks I'm from the UK. My sister, when she lived with me very briefly, she was very, very confused when everything on her YouTube came through as again, Moroccan. So, so this is the case, is that VPNs are incredibly good. It depends on what you're doing. I think VPNs are good, but the problem is a lot of security is kind of relied on understanding where you are as your platform. But VPNs do really come in handy, especially when you're traveling. So whether you are in an airport cafe or a Costa coffee shop or something along those lines, either use 3G and 4G, but VPNs come in really handy when you're kind of reliant on a public Wi-Fi. Because what a public Wi-Fi is, it's not secure. Anybody could be on that Wi-Fi to be able to read what you do and what you do on the internet. And that's where VPN really comes in handy to be able to utilize it. If you want to be really safe, you can install a VPN via router or on a software based on your computer, and it's really good that way as well. So yeah, I would recommend them. It's just sometimes they're a pain to utilize in some cases, and sometimes the kind of the trade-off between the risk, not always easy. So okay, Edwin, yeah, Mac OS Monterey iOS 15 updates, security fixes released today. It's how do you keep your router up to date? It's supplied by my internet provider. So it depends on how again savvy you feel or confident you feel around security. Again, it's not, again, it's kind of the low-hanging fruit. It's very much around what you're doing otherwise is okay, and securing the device and computer that you're actually working on. Yes, is it a nice to have? Absolutely. Is it the kind of belt and braces from your security settings sort of aspect? Yes. But what you can do is what you can go on your browser and actually access the admin functions of your router, and you can update the what's called the firmware on your router in order to update it. Now, not many people are very confident in having to do that. So I wouldn't necessarily say it is of the utmost importance to do. But it is the importance in order to update and make sure your devices that are in that home network are up to date and protected in that respect. So if there's anything you're going to be prioritizing, it's going to be that. Yeah, Mark, absolutely. Some routers do it automatically, some don't. Again, yeah, absolutely. I think especially from the ones that are provided by the internet providers, they're generally made to be as user friendly and as limited access from you as possible, because it's trying to maintain that security across the board. Okay, which authenticator do you use your watch? I use a combination between the Google Authenticator and also the main one I use is the Microsoft Authenticator, because I find it, again, it's Amazon, LastPass, a lot of different platforms work with it. So again, whatever I'm applying or trying to log into just comes up on a watch, press it, and it adds a little bit of extra security as well. Kevin, really good link about example of how leaked metadata can be used against you. Yeah, absolutely. I think I know which one you're talking about as well. Which antivirus would I recommend? I can't. The thing is, they're all of a kind of a muchness. Some will work better with Macs than others. I use something called Bitdefender as my main platform. But the thing is, like anything, they are so much more of a suite of programs. So depending on if you're getting free ones or if you're paying for ones, I prefer to get paid one because it comes with a suite of other security tools that come with it. But it's about shopping around, finding out what what you actually want to do, and be able to install that on your machine. And yeah, it's it's very much this case about trying to install it and secure yourself. But I can't really recommend anything specific one because they all have pluses and minuses. It's like any other product that you would ever come across as well. God bloody hell! You certainly questions. So I'm just reading through these, and I've just realised that there's another 25 different messages as well. So so I might try and start to kind of okay. So VPNs, yep. Install antivirus. I'm just going to try and triage if that's okay. I do apologize. So Simon, you have about 4 different authenticators on your platform. Absolutely, yeah, you do end up collecting them sometimes. Matt, you use BullGuard AV and VPN on both my iMac and Windows laptop. Find them very good. Absolutely, it's a good. If you find them actually quite applicable to be able to do that, then that makes sense as well. So I think as we kind of go through those VPN questions, do we want to kind of open up to the floor if there's any comments or suggestions or any other questions that you want me to kind of add? Because I'm just kind of trying to, again, there's so much engagement. I love it in the chat. So.
Gosh, you've stunned them into silence, Paul.
I know. It's like that digital tumbleweed moment.
This is Jim. I have a question.
Hello, Jim. I knew I could rely on somebody from Florida.
We're curious folk. I use 1Password and have used it for a long time. When I go to a financial website, I tend to use two-factor authentication. But when I click on the 1Password to load the login information, I get this fire red banner across the box that says this is a reused password. If I'm using 1Password for just that one site, I mean, the implication of this red banner warning is that I'm doing something insecure. But if I'm using only that password only for that website, how is that insecure?
So basically what a password manager will try and do is it will look at if there's any other copies of passwords within your manager. So for instance, again, although you may be using it for that one, there may be several copies of the record within your password manager. So it might be falsely identifying, but you got a reused password, don't use this anywhere else, big red banner. But sometimes, depending on which part of the website that you come in at, the password manager recognizes it and goes, well, there's 2 different websites in which I use this data. So then you've got 2 copies that work in different platforms. So what you need to do is you need to go into the vault of your 1Pass and go into the settings of it, and you'll see where those passwords are. And I think from what I gather from what that message would come up as, is it's basically if you've only ever used that password for your bank, it probably means that it's just got 2 copies sat in your vault, that it thinks that it's got 2 copies in that respect. Does that make sense?
That's annoying, isn't it?
It is annoying. Sorry, it is absolutely really annoying. Like I went through a massive binge on my password managers because I realized that I had 624 different passwords. Yeah, exactly. So it can be really annoying, but yeah, that's what I think. If you've only ever used that password specifically for that bank, but it's still coming up with that kind of notification saying, there's something wrong here, you've reused your password, it's most likely that. So
okay, I've got a perfect, this is Mitch from Florida. We get chatty down here. I got a perfect example of that. For Amazon, I have a very complicated 2-factor passcode that periodically I do change. Amazon owns Audible Books. So when I bring up Audible Books, it asks me for my password, and I use the Amazon password but when I pull up the Watchtower in 1Password, it says, oh, you're using this passcode on more than one site. And I don't really consider that more than one site.
No. And then that's the thing, is it's this kind of single login. For instance, Amazon, Microsoft, a lot of these different platforms, although you are using a single login to these multiple different platforms, and Amazon and Audible is a very good example, and you're signing in and verifying through this different methods, that's the thing, is that you end up having different websites that are accepting the same login, the same account, but you have that duplication. So it's not always a perfect sort of scenario, but you're absolutely right, Mitch. That's exactly what can happen in that respect as well.
And one more question. Since email is the big thing that gives out half of your data, as you said, how I've got a very complicated, I use Gmail and I'm trying to switch out of that because I don't like the way they steal your data, but changing emails is easier said than done, as I'm sure you're well aware.
Oh, yes.
But anyhow, I do change my password, and it's a very complicated one, and I use two-factor authentication. How often do you feel that it's necessary to change a passcode on something like Gmail or your main bank account?
So this, again, the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK actually suggests you shouldn't. So this is an interesting one because, and I think Phil in chat, I think I'm going to link this to your question as well, as you came in quite early with that, is that from an email point of view, changing your email, yes, massive pain. I can assure you of that. I know that. Now, the inconvenience of trying to change your emails is incredibly difficult. I've just recently gone through it, mainly because my email that I'd had for years and years and years is what I did was actually did it and transitioned over time. So I created an alternative email under the same account in Outlook and my Microsoft. So everything that came with Hotmail, I made a list of what contact was made through that email. What I then did was then go through that list, go to the accounts, change those emails, and I did it over time instead of doing it over a weekend or something like that because I've got no life. But it's this case where I did it over a transition period of time and I gently phased my old email out. And that's where I see Phil's question around the kind of element is like, how do I lose contacts, etc. Now, with the elements of social media, with the elements of our digital footprint, it's very difficult to lose contacts, even when we want to. So it's this very case where phase it out over time. People who communicate you, companies, organizations, just change that email if you want to, but you don't have to, because things like two-factor authentication and unique passwords give you the security that you would otherwise have. You don't have to change your email if you don't want to. It's just a good example for the fact that actually 50% of your education is the thing that you've had for the longest. So from a password point of view, we actually suggest that you don't change it. Yes, it's got to be unique, but we suggest that we don't change it unless you think it's been compromised, because it doesn't necessarily matter. The guidance has actually gone out the window around that kind of 30, 60, 90 days redo, because what the NCSC and a lot of the security industry has realized is that actually it makes us less secure the more we're trying to conveniently swap our passwords. Because guess what? If, for instance, even in organizations, when you had 30, 60-day resets on passwords, what you'd end up doing is summer 1, 2, and then you'd have summer 13, and then summer 14, and then you'd have summer 15, and the same password would be repeated over time because it's that trade-off. So we'd always suggest if you've got a unique password, you don't need to change it unless you think it's compromised, but also put in that two-factor authentication where you can as well. Simon, I think you put your hand up next, I believe.
Yeah.
Have you got a nuclear control room behind you by the looks of it?
Oh, yeah. Actually, apparently this is the Savannah nuclear plant in
I was going to say, yeah.
Anyway, I just chose to look. Yes, everybody says, what the hell is that? Apparently, the Savannah nuclear plant in America.
It's actually his house.
Yeah, I wish it was.
Simon, live from Chernobyl.
Yeah. Well, I did want to find like the Chernobyl plant, but no, I had no luck. But I'd like to say, and Mike will know this, I'm a big fan of services, as you mentioned earlier, like 33mail.com, simplelogin.com. Okay. And the purpose of those is simply to, I know Apple have now had mask your email and all those, which is great. But long before that, and they're still useful even if you still use that, which is basically you use that service.
Yes.
33mail offers you, I think, 9 or 10 aliases, simple login. Quite, I can't remember exactly, but a fair number for free. There's a paid tier above that with with extra options, but basically, what you do is you can create an on-the-fly email address to log in. You know, I've seen this offer to buy cheap Reeboks. Right? Instead of giving them your real email address, you go to 33 Mail, general or simple login. You generate this account on the fly, and call it great offers at Reebok, right? Dot something, and you give them that, and they get that, and it's masked, and it's then redirected to whatever account you wish.
Yes, yeah.
And I recommend them to everybody because they're free and easy to use, and simply you can use those to log into any account you like. And if that account, you know, becomes compromised or they start,
and it's expendable,
spamming you, simply log into your account and go, you know, that alias, goodbye. And anything that, you know, they were spamming you now comes back as non-returned. The other thing was, that as you're saying, you know, I don't think people necessarily understand what they're giving away, and it's quite difficult to explain to people sometimes just how easily they're being exploited.
And that's the thing, Simon, is it's and it's interesting because although I come from a much more security background, etc., and cyber and fraud and all these sorts of things, is that actually it's completely understandable as to why people don't motivate themselves in the first place. And that's the really difficult part, because so often is that we're not motivated to protect it. And again, because so much of our online life, for thousands of years, for instance, we have been configured to value the things that we can hold, we can see, we can feel, we can touch. Now, psychology moves a darn sight slower than technology.
Real life, yeah. I mean, I can give you two, or I can give the other listeners, if you like, two examples which I know for a fact, right? One is, as you were mentioning, flying on aeroplanes, right? And people get scared about flying on aeroplanes. Flying on an aeroplane, person per mile, is the safest form of travel there is.
Yeah.
The trouble is, humans are terribly bad at processing risk. What happens is, if an aeroplane crashes, 500 people die in a horrible fireball, right? And people see that as horrible. And yet, I don't know, however many thousand people a day are killed, right, in car crashes. But we don't process that, or, you know, or being hit by buses or whatever. That's not considered a terribly big risk. And the other one is in the First World War, right? The guys in the trenches were terrified of the whiz bangs and the shrapnel bombs, which actually killed very few people. They made a lot of noise and flash, and the people were terrified of them. But they didn't actually consider the chatter, you know, of machine guns to be very frightening, although machine guns actually killed way more guys who went over the top than whiz bangs.
Absolutely.
And this is the problem. Humans have a terrible way.
We're not, and that's the thing, Simon. And I'm just mindful of the time, because you're absolutely right. And this is the research that I'm looking at, because it's very much down to the relationship we have with technology that really shows this. And again, it almost exacerbates the problem that we are very, very poor at examining risk. We are not intuitive statisticians. I don't look at a stat and think, actually, hold on a second. If this stat means that I'm a much higher probability of being a victim of fraud, then I'll better alter my behavior. People don't look at stats and think that. Jan, I know you've got your hand up as well. I wanted to make sure that we came to you as well.
Can I make a 10-second noise first?
Sorry,
Simon, could I trouble you just to pop those web addresses into the chat?
What was that? 33 Mail and...
Yes.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you. Sorry, Paul. Thank you.
That's right. Jan.
Okay, thank you. It's not that I'm not motivated, it's that I'm so terrified I won't even do an online bank account. And it's because I don't know. So many of the things you've been talking about and people have been asking questions on, I haven't got a clue.
Yeah.
And it's and I think a lot of people are like me actually. So it's where do you go to find out the basics? I mean, you know, for say understanding Macs, we used to go to the missing manual, and I don't even know whether there is still a Mac missing manual these days. But I was just wondering, I mean, I don't even know what a data breach is or what it looks like. So I was just wondering, is there a website or is there a simple book, or how do you go about finding out so you can actually put in action all the different things that have been suggested?
And that's the thing. Yes, so there's Get Safe Online. So let me just make sure I get the right website to put into chat, which is a particularly good. Let's try and get it online. There we go. So Get Safe Online is a particularly good resource, and it's really simple guidance and really around shopping, banking, payments, protecting yourself. It's kind of really kind of brought subjected into those different aspects as well. It's also really good to have a website that you go to find this information, because it does change quite often. It keeps up to date. So I would always say go to things like Get Safe Online, because if you're normally when a book is published around protecting yourself online, it's normally out of date by the time it's published. So try to have a look at this time the website. There's also the NCSC website. So the National Cybersecurity Center. If I go to advice and guidance, here we go. Now, NCSC might be a little bit more business, but I would say Get Safe Online is probably the best option for you in relation to exactly what you just said, Jan. And that's the thing, is that because we don't have the knowledge in the first place, is that so much of you're absolutely right, so much of the advice out there that you see all the time is like, well, what does this mean to me? What does a data breach mean to me? And all these sorts of things. And in this case, is a data breach is basically, so for instance, Jan Brownfoot, your email, your password, etc. If you've done, if you've had dealings with a company, whether you've had an account, whether you've had something along those lines, TalkTalk back in 2016, for instance, was a big data breach where all of their customer details were published and put out into the internet. So that is a really good example of a data breach in this respect, because what happens when that data is then put out there is that then people can utilize that data to gain accounts, or to identity theft, or to try and ring you up and say, hello, Mrs. Brownfoot, unfortunately, this account's been compromised, something along those lines. And that's what people will use the data for. Right. And that's the thing. This is why I'm quite critical of the education that we do as an industry, is because we assume that everybody knows what we're talking about.
Yeah, but we don't.
No, we don't. And then that's the biggest thing as well. So, but yes, getsafeonline.org, very, very good resource, and a good place to start.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure.
Simon appears to have two hands up.
Sorry. Yeah, I've just pasted a couple in there from people I've had on my podcast in the past, which is allthingsecured.com, which is a really kind of, beginner's guide to how to keep yourself safe. Pixelprivacy.com, which is another site that, has endless kind of really simple things you can do to protect yourself. And of course, for everybody, if you're in the least bit worried, haveibeenpwned.com, which will tell you if any of your data has been exposed.
No, it's a good example. It's a good example. And also the fact is that there's so interestingly enough, I'm actually the national rep for the Take 5 campaign. So from a fraud point of view is a particularly good example. And let me just Take 5 to stop fraud, and I'll get that to bring to you as well. So if I go 1 second. Here we go. So Take 5 is also a particularly good aspect around fraud as well. So there's lots of resources in order for you to explore as well. But also, for instance, again, this week I've been filming twice for BBC Morning Live. And in March, I will be a regular on the next series of Crime Watch as well. So we'll be doing quite a lot of TV stuff from this year going forward as well. So, but yeah, there's a lot of resources out there to help you well and truly. But again, it all comes down to the fact that what we talked about today is around valuing the data in the first place. Because if you get that right and you get that kind of intentional choice around it, no matter what sort of fraud or something like that might come your way, is that actually you have an understanding of what it is that you're protecting in the first place as well. So I think, Mike, we're there, aren't we?
I think we are. What a fantastic 90 minutes. Thank you so much. I can't believe how quickly it's passed. Really, really first class presentation. Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you very much. No, great pleasure, real pleasure. And again, even if it's just helped you a little bit, just to start thinking about security, or again, as Jan quite rightly said, well, actually, where do I go and where do I go for this information? And I just hope it was useful. I'd really hope it was useful.
Thank you. Can I just point out to everybody, I'm sure most people know this, but if you want to save the chat, because it's got lots and lots and lots of important addresses in it, you'll need to click on the chat button at the bottom of your screen, which will open up a chat column on the right side of your screen. And at the bottom right hand corner of that column, there are 3 little dots in a horizontal row. And if you click on that, one of the options is save. Save chat. Okay.
And that will save it out to a text document for you.
Yeah. And I will, of course, have a copy here if anybody makes a mistake and fails miserably. And
Like me.
That's right. It's great. You know.
Paul, thanks again.
My pleasure.
First class evening and really, really useful. Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. First class afternoon here.
Thank you very much. Good to know. Good to know.
And folks, I'll be in touch, obviously, about our little EGM, which, as I said, I hope will be on February the 9th, 2 weeks from this evening. I doubt it will take longer than half an hour, but that depends on questions, obviously, from you. And don't forget our February meeting with Sheeta, which is actually a meeting I've already attended because she did it for one of the USA mugs.
And it's outstanding. It's outstanding.
That's the word.
I was there and it was outstanding. You don't want to miss it.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, everybody. And see you next month.
Thank you, Paul.
Thanks,
My pleasure, everybody.
Paul.
Take care.
Brilliant, Paul.
Paul.
Well done.
Stay safe, as we say. Think twice.